All right, so we are going to be making a coil form. To get started, I need to first decide what it is that I want to make. And so that's in regards to the specific form. I like to start on a piece of paper and think of the form itself. Where does it taper? Where does it flare? What kind of form are you making? And this is a great opportunity for you to think of intention, and also to think of formal qualities such as like physical balance, the foot to lip ratio and things like that. So think of first the form that you would like to make. Then what you can do is take a piece of cardboard. This is just a flap from a clay box, and I'm going to make myself a template. And what I will do to make the template is draw half of the pot or form or whatever it is that I'm going to make. I'm just using a really pretty classic form right here. So what I'm going to be doing is drawing half of the piece, just one half. And then this cardboard, of course, will limit the size of my piece, the scale, the height of it, but it's a good place to start. So now when I'm drawing the top part of the piece, I'm going to move down just a little bit from the top edge of the cardboard so that it will help me to create a nice finish, level lip on the piece. And then down at the foot or the bottom, I'm going to go all the way to the bottom of the cardboard. And so after I've sketched, I'm going to finalize my lines a bit more. And then I will cut it out. So I'm making a template, and it's kind of a strange thing, but I'm actually not going to be using the silhouette of the pot. Instead, I'm going to be using this negative space. So I know it's kind of tight to get into some of those corners, but I can go back and I can fix them up later. So this template is to just kind of keep my form on track and make sure that I can achieve my intended form. So I just want to go in and clean up. So if my piece were, oops, if this is just half, oh, for heaven's sakes, if this is half, this is the top, and it does help to actually label it, as I just got confused here. This is the top, therefore this is the bottom. So now I have my template, and this is what I cut out of it. So if I flip this over, I can see that provided that I keep this template going halfway into the pot, this is roughly the way the form will look. That'll be about the size of it and about the width of it. So now I'm ready to get started making my base. So to make my base, I'm going to start with some wedged clay, and the base of my piece could be made either from a pinch pot or it could be made from a flat piece of clay called a slab. I am going to be using a slab in this demonstration, but if you wanted to start with a pinch pot, that's perfectly legitimate. You just need to make certain that you are using your template as a reference, which will make sense as we continue on. So for me to start with a slab, this is a bit more clay than what I need for the size piece that I'm making. So I'm just going to cut the clay apart, and then the leftover I'm going to wrap in plastic and set aside so that I can use it to make my coils later. So now all I'm going to do is just press the slab into a disc, and I need to be conscientious of how thick this disc is, because if it's too thin, it can crack while I'm constructing upward, and if it's too thick, it's going to dry at a different rate and start to cause issue with drying and firing of the piece as I'm constructing. So I just pressed it lightly. I could use a slab roller for this, but as a beginner or somebody who's working at home, it's just easy to press it. It's not really very big. So I can use the measuring tool of my thumb here. This last joint on my thumb is roughly equal to 1 inch. And so I can see here, it's maybe a little bit less than 1/2 inch, maybe 1/3 of an inch. And I think that that's pretty good. The other thing is I want this to be roughly equal, or maybe even a little bit thicker than what my walls will be. And my walls are going to be roughly as thick as my pinky or as thick as a pencil. So something like that. And you can see right here, that's pretty relative. So that's a good space for me to start. Now the other thing is I'm working on a porous surface, a wood surface, and you can see it's taking moisture out of my clay. So before I get started, I will lay down some plastic. And I'm going to put my board inside the plastic bag, and this will allow me to have a longer work time. I'm going to tuck the bag around the board so that everything is nice and secure and I don't have to worry about it bunching up on me while I am trying to work. It may still do it, but it's going to be a little bit less annoying. So now I've got my slab, and I like to spend just a little bit of time compressing the clay. So I'm going to just use a silicone rib for that. Another thing that I do sometimes is throw the slab down and stretch it. But again, as a beginner, this is a good place for you to start. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I actually want to make this circular or round. And so it's helpful to find a template, something that you can trace. And so for me, I'm going to use this yogurt container. If I look at my template, I can see that my form, my intended form, if I go from the top edge, goes roughly to the middle of this container. So I can use this as a template. And so I'm just going to flip it over and trace it and then cut out what it is that I need. I'm just using my needle tool. And so I can see I got it a little bit dirty because my container was not clean, and I will clean that in a bit. So I want to be careful not to cut through into the plastic, just because that's going to start to create problems for me later if I shred my plastic now. So I'm just not pushing all the way down to the plastic. And then pull off the excess, and I like to store that in a plastic bag so I can reclaim it later. So I'll just set that aside in a plastic bag. And so I'm going to clean this up real quick so I have less to clean up later. And I know that it'll be on the inside of the piece, but it's nice to consider the quality right now. A tool that I like to use for these kinds of edges is this synthetic chamois. My students call it a chamois, but it's like a diver's towel. Some people use them for cleaning cars and things like that, but it's made out of synthetic material. You can get them also made out of leather. But it's a nice way to address your edges without using a sponge and therefore eroding away the surface of the clay. The other thing is I don't want it to be like sopping wet or anything like that. So after I use my chamois, I like to rinse it out and squeeze it out, and I just hang it on the edge of my water container. Okay, so now that I have a base, I am ready to take a look at making coils. Okay, so making coils, I'm going to again start out with some wedged clay, and it's nice to have like a big flat open surface to work on. I do prefer sealed surfaces like epoxy resin, wood. I like plastic as well. Some artists, actually a lot of artists, like to use canvas, but I find that usually dries out my clay a little bit more rapidly. But because most of you will probably be working on wood or something like canvas, I will demonstrate how to use this material for maximum benefit. So I'm tearing off a bit of clay that I'm going to work with. The other thing that I'd like to point out is the condition of my hands. My hands right now have a lot of dry clay on them. So before I get started, I am going to prepare my hands. I like to use water and make sure to remove the dust from my hands, but you can see my hands are wet. They're like shiny and slimy. That's too wet. So what I'm going to do now is use a damp towel and remove the excess moisture from my hands. Now, I don't want my hands to be dry. I want them to be slightly moist. There's that word. I like a nice thin barrier of moisture on my hands. And I will be frequently reapplying moisture to my hands while I work through this process to ensure that my coils do not dry out. So I'll just pick up a little bit of moisture and rub it into my hands so that they have a thin layer of moisture, kind of like a lotion, but they're not dripping wet and slimy. Okay, so to make a coil, I'm going to take my clay and I'm going to just start to squeeze it into a rope shape of sorts. And I want it to be somewhat consistent. Because I'm working with a larger amount of clay, I like to start this way. And then simply, I'm just going to be rocking the clay back and forth. And again, I'm attending to the moisture level on my hands while I do this. If I start to accumulate too much clay on my hands or my hands get too dry, I add moisture. This makes all the difference when you're rolling coils. Now, the other thing that makes a big difference is you want the coil to be rolling from the tip of your finger as far back as you can on your hand, because you want the coil to rotate completely around itself. So if I started here, I want to make sure that the coil rolls all the way back around to the top. Otherwise, a common mistake is that coils will only be rolled forwards and backwards just slightly, and then you get a flat coil. So the other thing that's important to note is I'm not really applying pressure to the clay. I'm just using the weight of my hands. Now, I can see here it's not so round. It's kind of becoming a little ovular, so I'm going to set it up on its end and press it down just a bit. And then I'm just going to gradually move my hands from the center towards the outside. And again, still attending to the moisture level on my hands. You can feel it, you know? And if your hands feel like they're starting to crack or, get dry, you feel like you're going to have dust on your clay, just take a second to add a little bit of moisture. It feels much better on your hands. It's less messy, less dusty, and you'll have a significantly better product for your coil. So my goal with my coil, I kind of like to roll them a bit thick. You can see it's thicker than my thumb, especially for the kind of piece that I'm making right here, because I'm not going to just work with it round like this. I actually like to flatten it. So instead of just being a rounded coil, I'm actually making something that I refer to as a sloil or a slab coil. So once I have a pretty consistent coil, it's not perfect. You know, there's a couple of weird areas and things like that, but that isn't a problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick it up and throw it down, and so that I have a flat edge on one side. And then I could rotate it and do the same thing, but it's kind of hard to get it exactly on the other side. So what I like to do is use a brayer or a roller. And this one has been used on red clay, so I need to clean it just a little bit, or have red clay on my white clay, which is probably not that big of a deal. But again, when I'm using this tool, or I could use a rolling pin, I'm not using a lot of pressure. I'm just using the weight of my hand and my arm, and the tool itself. So there's lots of reasons that I like to do this, which is, again, to make the sloil instead of just a round coil. But for me, I find this to be a much faster process than just building with round coils, because I'm getting more height more quickly. So anyway, I am going to repeat this process several times, but in the meantime, when I finish with a sloil, I'm going to wrap it up in plastic nice and tight on a wooden board so it's easy to transport and easy to store. If it's too long, I can cut it. Generally speaking, I like to avoid doing that until I'm going to start building with it. So I'll just get another plastic bag and I will continue making this.
She calls me day and night. I'm sorry, girl, you just don't make me feel right. I never meant to make you cry, you were right. Just leave me, I'm nothing to amplify.
Okay, so I have some sloils made. I have my base here. I have it on a banding wheel, so it's easy for me to turn and see all sides. But in the meantime, I changed my camera position so you can actually see what I'm looking for, because before I put my first sloil down, I need to review my template. You can see here, this is the top of my template, and of course this is my bottom. And what I'm going to be doing is placing the sloils so that they start to follow this profile right here. So first things first, I can see way down at the bottom here, my base is not actually matching my template. So I need to bevel this, or I could add a little coil down there. Either way. So I think what I'll do is I like to use my silicone rib once again, and I'm going to just kind of run it along to make a profile, because my clay is quite plastic, and you can see that that is actually matching now. So I'll do that around the entire piece. And as I accumulate clay, I like to use my sponge and wipe off the excess, because otherwise my profiling tool is not clean and it will leave unwanted, unintentional marks. So I know, especially in the beginning, the plastic can be a little bit annoying as it bunches and moves. Oh, for heaven's sakes, or very annoying. I could tape it into place too, but as I get going here, it will be less of an issue. I also like to keep my scraps all together so I have less to clean up at the end of my making session. So I have started the bevel, and I'll refine this later as I progress with my piece, but what I like to do is I will rotate and just check my profile at least in 4 locations, the sides and the front and the back, just to kind of double check and see where I'm at. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my first sloil on. But the first thing I need to do is actually prepare my surface. I'm going to be using the retractable scoring tool from Zem tools here, so that I can actually score and slip. So I'm going to be adding my sloil up on top so that it can start to angle inward here. And anytime you are attaching, especially in the first session of coiling, I like to have a really nice scored surface. So I am scratching crosshatch marks nice and deep into my foundation so that I have a place for my slip to go. So it's just an opportunity to have my surfaces meld together. And personally, rather than slip, I prefer to use water. So I'm just going to get some water on my hake brush, and I'm just going to add water to my score marks, and I'm going to kind of brush them lightly until the water starts to get cloudy with the clay. So what I'm doing is I'm making slip right on the surface. You might prefer to make slip from slaked down bone dry clay and apply the slip directly to the surface, and that is just fine, but you need to make certain that your slip is not so thick that it's going to clog your score marks. So after I have that, now I can take my first sloil. In this case, remember, it is a coil that has been flattened. And then I can place it, and I can see that's actually going to be a good length. But I need to remember that I don't want it to necessarily just go vertical. So now the other thing is this is not necessarily flat. You can see how it's flat up here. I mean, it's undulating up there. And what I can do is I can actually bevel this as well. So I'm going to take my silicone rib and make roughly a 45-degree angle on one edge so that it'll be easier for me to place my sloil so it will start to angle inward. I'm not removing much clay, just a little bit. I'm more or less just pressing the clay because it's so soft and plastic. And so now, if I were to place it on here, I would see that it's going to start to angle inward as I would like it to do, like that. So before I attach anything, of course, I'm going to be using my scoring tool, and I'm going to scratch. Again, notice how deep those marks are. This is imperative for a strong bond. And I'm going to go back and cross through them again. And then I am going to use my brush with some water, and I'm just setting the water down. These bristles are extremely soft, so I am not manipulating my score marks at all when I do this. If you have a stiffer brush that you're using and you find that the brush is closing your score marks, instead of brushing, what you can do is you can tap and that will start to cause the clay and the water to mix to make slip directly on the surface, which is what we are trying to do. And of course, once again, you could use actual slip, which is bone dry clay slaked down in water. So I'm adding just a little bit more here onto the surface, and then I'm ready going to add those two together. Okay, so everything is scored. I will pick up my sloil that is beveled and scored, and I will attach it score mark to score mark. And I'm going to just lightly compress to get them in at so that they're actually coming into contact. The score marks are coming into contact together. And before I cut off this excess, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check my template, and I'm close. And that's close enough for where I'm at right now, because I'll be able to adjust this since the clay is so soft. So I'm going to let these overlap, and then what I will do is I'm going to use my knife, and I'm going to cut through both of them. So this inner part and this outer part, but I'm going to cut through them at an angle. And then I'm going to remove this excess on the outside, and I'm going to remove this excess on the inside. And actually that is still a little long, so I will cut once again. Again, cutting through both of them. I did cut into my base a little bit, but that's not a huge problem. And so keep my scraps together so I have less of a mess to clean up later. And then this part, I'm going to score and slip together as well. The other reason I just use water instead of slip is I tend to find it is a little bit tidier, which is generally my MO when I'm in the studio. I would like to spend more time making and less time cleaning. Okay, so now, once again, I need to make sure that my bond is strong. So I'm just going through and pressing my scored areas together. And then I will actually stitch these together with a little bit more clay. I've got this excess clay here, so I can take it and I can roll a little coil that will serve as like a weld to put those two together. So I'm going to roll this just a little bit thinner. So it's not for getting height or anything like that, but that is to work these areas together. There's already some good slip in there, and the clay is nice and soft. So I'm just going to stick it into that negative space, and I'm going to press it in. And I don't do this for every coil. That would take forever. This is just really important because it's the foundation of your piece, and you want it to be strong so that it won't separate from your base. And then I don't have really much left over. Now, the other thing that I want to do is make sure that this looks nice and finished. And so I will just take a wooden tool. Any wooden tool will really do. Think of the profile of the wooden tool. You could also consider using your finger. And I'm just going to go in and pull the tool through the clay to really make that bond strong. Wipe off the excess. And I'm going to repeat a couple of times to make sure that there's no gaps or areas that just look particularly unsightly. Okay, so that's a good place for me to start. And now what I'm going to do is continue moving upward. You can see I've started to flare in. Again, I'll adjust this later. It'll be easy for me to push out, but now I need to go vertical. So I'm going to do a sloil where I don't put a bevel and just set it right up on top. And it's also important to note that I don't need the soil to be very tall. I can tap the edge of it, the outside edge of the soil, to make it more flat. And I can determine how long this needs to be. I try to keep as much of these soils as possible because I don't really want to waste any. So I just made a mark that's a little bit longer than what I need. And then this excess I'm going to wrap up in plastic again. So now I've got this soil, and it will go directly on top of this one. And before I put it on there, I'm going to check my profile, and I can see that that's a bit taller than what I need. So I could go back and cut that off, or I can use it as a foundation for this next soil. So I'm going to actually attach this on here, but being that we have a nice strong foundation, this is where coiling and soiling get pretty cool. So I'm cutting off the excess right now, and the excess inside as well as the outside. And so I can actually, because the clay is so plastic, I can actually forego the score and slip at this point and just stitch them together using my fingers. Because it is really soft. But it's important to remember that what I do on the outside, I need to do on the inside. And truthfully, the mark making, the melding together on the inside is even more imperative, because you can make aesthetic decisions where you actually leave the coils or sloils exposed on the outside for textural reasons and things like that. But on the inside, they definitely need to be stitched together. So I can easily get my hand in here, and I'm just pushing my thumb down on the inside to get it blended. Might be a better camera angle for you at this point. So I can just rotate it and I can stitch like this. But if you're having a hard, and I'm also stitching back up too, if you have a hard time reaching in those areas, that's where your wood tools come in handy, that you can go in and you can stitch with your tools instead of your hands. So remember, tools are intended to be extensions of your hands. Okay, so I have them stitched together on the inside and roughly on the outside. And you can see it's somewhat relative to my template, but before I get into the details of fixing that up and making it more appropriate, I'm going to add one more sloil, which will be this one here, to have it flare outward. And I'm going to attach it on the outside of this one. So it will have a nice connection point. So first things first, I will get my sloil. I'll determine how long it needs to be to make it all the way around. I know it doesn't need to be quite that long, so I can tear off some, make it easier to manage. Oops. And so, of course, if something is going to be wider, you're going to need a longer sloil. And if something is more narrow, it is a shorter sloil. Okay, so that is pretty close. Again, I like to make it a little bit longer than what I think I will need. Wrap up the excess with plastic and wrap it well. So now you'll also notice that the sloil has started to turn into like a rainbow or an arch. And this is directly relational to something that we'll do later with slabs of clay. So I can just bevel this a little bit with my finger because again, the clay is super plastic. And then I will score on the outside because this is where I'm going to be working. And then always go back and cross your score marks for a stronger bond. And now I'm going to do the same on my sloil. Add water. I like to really be cognizant that I'm not allowing the water to run down the piece, and see, it's going right down there, because otherwise the bottom can get really mushy and take on a lot of water, and then you'll have structural issues later. Which leads me to, there's only a point that I can continue working on this until it is just too wet and it can no longer support its own weight. So at that point, I either need to use a heat gun or a hair dryer to stiffen up the lower levels of the clay, or I can store it for a while and then come back to it later. So now I'm going to place my sloil. This first section I'm going to press in rather firmly so that it can support itself as I go around. It's wonderful that the clay is as wet as it is because it'll be easy for me to adjust to my template. And so I leave this excess on here so that I can take a look at my template and see how I'm doing. I'm pretty close to where I need to be. But again, this clay is nice and soft, so it's easy for me to work with. I'm going to check it in at least 4 places, and they're all pretty darn relative to one another. So the length of this sloil is appropriate, so I'm going to cut off the excess, and note, once again, I cut through both ends of the sloil, take off and set aside the scrap. And then I can put these together. Now, the less water or slip you use, the more dry the clay will be. And so there's less wait time in it. But since this was such a dramatic plane change, like I shifted the plane so that it started to flare outward, I felt like it was important for me to score and slip on it. So I'm spending just a little bit of time compressing and making sure that the sloils are in contact with one another. And now I can spend a little bit of time with my ribs to define and refine the connection points. So I'm going to start with my serrated rib. You'll notice my serrated rib is clipped. It's not a full serrated rib, and this makes it easier for me to get into tight areas. So I'm going to always support on the outside and then blend into the form. And I like to extend that connection up a little bit higher. All that clay that I've collected, I'm going to wipe it off. And then I'm going to check my template and see what needs to be done. So here I can start to use my pinch technique. So I can actually adjust the clay to meet the template. So I know that it needs to go out further. And I'm going to check it in more than just 4 areas. I'm going to actually check it quite a few times as I rotate around the piece. So this part needs to be tucked in and this needs to be flared out. You can see the template makes lots of unintentional marks on the piece. I will be addressing those later. I'm just really focusing on getting my appropriate form right now. There. So that looks pretty good in this area, but then down here, it needs some work. So I'm going to use my serrated rib tool to plane, because I have all these unwanted dents and divots and things like that. And I also want the clay to flare outward more on the foot. And it may need me to actually add some clay down at the bottom. So now I can press the clay outward. And I think I will. Oops. I will need to add a coil on here. But because it's such a small area, I will roll a small coil. Again, I'm checking the status of my hands, making sure that they're clean, they have a little bit of moisture, because otherwise you'll find that your coils are going to crack on you and then they become really annoying to work with. So I take a little scrap of my sloil, squish it, and then I can roll it in my hands, or I can roll it right on my work surface, which I will find a bit more useful because it's going to be longer. And if I just roll it in my hands, whoops, it will probably crack and break. And in that case, it broke, but I can still use it. So I want it to be consistent. And then I'll be attaching it down here, and I can just kind of set it and take a look and see if that's going to be, nope, not quite. So what I can do is I can actually press this out. I'm making it like a wedge shape. So basically just look at the shapes that you need and see how you can achieve them. So that is probably a bit more appropriate for what I need, because it needed to fill more of the negative space. So we're getting closer, and I may be able to move this clay outward as well. So I will continue in that vein, and I will also continue upward, placing the coils in reference to my template. The most important thing to remember here is when you want to go straight up and down, you just put your sloils or coils directly on top of one another. If you want to flare outward or to make the piece wider, you put the sloil or coil on the outside of the one that it's being placed on. And if you want it to taper or go inward, you put it on the inside of the lower sloil, or you put a bevel on it so that it can start to angle inward. And so I will work with roughly 3 to 5 sloils, depending on the form that I'm working with and depending on the state of the clay. And then I will use a heat gun to dry it, and then I will come back and I will build more. So I use the heat gun to stiffen up this section a bit before I add it on the next sloil. I am checking my template and it's looking pretty close. I can tell I still am going to need to adjust down here, but I can do that later. But for the most part, this is looking fairly accurate. I'll be able to refine it more as the piece moves along, but it's important to just keep checking my templates. So then I will go through and I'll blend these, and then I'm going to start to, I'll go vertical for a little while, and then I'll start to taper inward. And you'll notice I have score marks, serration rib marks all over the piece. These are for the purpose of blending as well as planing the form to get rid of bumps and lumps and dents and things like that. The piece is too wet and is still in progress for me to be able to go back and use my flat rib to make it look nice. So right now, again, all I'm really concerned with is the form. I will keep working the form, and then I will go back and address the surface later, after I have my form much closer to finished, and it is as intentional as I would like it to be. But stitching these together is really imperative. So I have my hand, my left hand on the outside, and my right hand, I'm using a fair amount of force to make sure that those sloyals are really blended together. Also, I don't have much water on this piece at all, because that will only weaken it. And so I will address this outside area. I can flip it over. It is still quite plastic, so I have to be cognizant of that. And that's, this particular form works for this. You may not be able to do this until your piece is quite a bit further along. It really depends on the form and the state of your clay. So you can see how I'm using the serrated rib to stitch everything together. And it's still super duper plastic, so it is flexing and giving a little bit. I need to make sure that it's not going to compromise the structural integrity of the object as I move along. And I don't want to leave it like this either, because that will change my form. I'm going to have to go back when I set it upright again and readjust my form to match my template. So I'm going forwards and backwards until those separations are gone. And so now I can start to plane this just a little bit. I could also address this foot, because otherwise, if I leave these gaps and cracks in there, this stuff from adding the coil on to the outside, when it starts drying, that will be a primo area for chipping. And it may even separate depending on how quickly or forcefully I dry it or fire it. So I want to make sure that that is blended and combined. And I always scratch in multiple directions and push the clay together. Okay, so that's pretty good. Now, set it upright, check my template, not bad. And then I will move on to the next sloyal. This one I want to be almost vertical. But if my clay is too wet, I may have to use my hairdryer or heat gun to make sure that this lower section can support this. Hey, not bad. That's pretty darn close. Check it in multiple areas once again. So that's getting out a little far, so I'll adjust it in. There we go. So you can see how useful this template is. Smooth that out. Okay, I'm ready to attach it. If you accidentally cut through, make sure to bond it together, because that will cause a weak point.
Every time you wake up feeling worse and then you check the time. It's never what it feels like, just throw me a dime. If everything was good then you would feel alive. If everything was good then you would feel alive.
So now I'm going to start to close in the form, so I need to address the inside and compress all of the clay. So I'm going to be taking my flat rib. This is the one that has a smooth edge, and I'm going to use the rounded part of it. I like to make sure the tool is clean and slightly damp before I begin. Then I'm going to support it on the outside and really work to compress the clay together on the inside, because I won't be able to get inside here once I close the form up. I am going to be accumulating some clay on my rib, so I need to make certain that I take the time to clean that clay off, keep my tool clean and damp for the best results. Nice, clean, intentional surface on the inside and the outside. We'll deal with the outside later, because we'll always be able to access that. But again, I need to be thinking ahead and thinking about my intentional form. I won't be able to reach the inside of this piece once I start to close it. It's going to become too challenging. So I need to make certain to address what I can when I can. I'm also cognizant of the moisture content of the clay. If I feel like it's starting to sag, particularly in these areas here, I may need to stop, use my hairdryer or heat gun a little bit, and then wait until it's stiffened up and it can support itself before I move forward. But since I used the heat gun and hairdryer earlier, it seems to be holding its own just fine. I also need to be aware of how thin the clay may be getting. This smoothing not only looks good, but it is actually melding the clay together and combining it so that it's actually going to be stronger. I like to then use my silicone rib to further compress and to just make it look even nicer. I advise against using a sponge though, because the sponge can add moisture and actually remove some of those smaller particles of clay, which are very important to the structural integrity of the work. And then I'll go in with my ShamWow and address any of the other areas that are a little bit more difficult for me to get into with a tool. And of course, I have a camera in my face too, so it's a little bit more challenging for me right now. You can probably see a lot of areas that I've missed. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but do realize, depending on the form that you're making, you may be able to see inside. And you don't want to make it disappointing in quality on the inside. All right, so I am going to use a little heat gun on this piece, and then I will move forward with my soils. So I've used the hair dryer, or you can use a heat gun. And so it's getting quite a bit more stiff. It's not dry by any means. It's still flexible. So I'd call it like a pretty darn soft leather hard right now. But it is not really plastic. Like if I was to bend it, it would probably crack. So now I can see my next sloil will be placed towards the inside of this one here. Oops. So it'll start to angle inward as I would like it to do. And whenever you're changing directions on a coil pot, like we did down here, so we went in, then we went up, and then we have a pretty severe direction change right here where we change to go out. This is where I would score and slip. And especially as you get taller, you want to make sure that the clay is dry enough to support itself. That's why I use the hair dryer up here, so that it's not so flexible. And I will then also score and slip these together. And you can see that I am pretty close to the form that I'm looking for, my intentional form. And then I will continue all the way through. And as I'm getting to the end of my sloils, I'm going to use my scraps and pieces that I have, but I make sure to also score and slip the ends together.
He never answers me. When I call, it makes me feel so lonely. Didn't think you'd give up so easily. Yesterday and laughter feels so far away. I miss the